The most sought-after architect in the country, a woman whose towers had rewritten 3 city skylines, and whose face had been on the cover of a national magazine under the words, "The Builder," found her missing husband 19 months after he vanished, on his knees on a wet kitchen floor, scrubbing the grease trap of a harbour cafe in a Cape Breton town she had never heard of. And the first thing he said when he looked up was a sentence she had spent 19 months never once imagining. She had not meant to be there at all. Greer Maddox had flown into Sydney 2 days earlier for a site walk on a community centre her firm was building near the Mira River, a small commission she had taken on for almost nothing, and worked on harder than any of the glass things that had made her name. The visit had ended early. The clients were happy. Her flight back to Toronto was the following evening, and she had a whole day with nothing in it, which had become, in the last year and a half, the most dangerous thing a day could have. So she had rented a car and driven the long way around, up onto the Cabot Trail, because someone at the hotel had said it was worth seeing in late October, when the leaves came down off the highlands in sheets of rust and copper. She had driven with the radio low, the heater ticking, the Atlantic showing itself grey and enormous between the trees. She had not been looking for anything. That was the thing she would come back to, later lying awake. She had not been looking. She had stopped believing she would ever find him somewhere around the 11th month, the way you stop believing in a tide that never comes, and she had let the not believing become a kind of floor she could stand on. The town was called Carrick Cove, and it was barely a town. A wharf, a fish plant with half its windows boarded, a church with a white steeple, and a sign out front announcing a fall supper, a general store with a hand-lettered notice about wool in the window, and at the bottom of the one road, where it bent toward the water, a low building with a tin roof and a screen door, and a painted sign that read Tobin's, the letters faded to the colour of weak tea. The lights were on. It was 4 in the afternoon, and already going dark the way it does out east in October, and she was cold and tired of her own company, and so she pulled in. A bell over the door announced her. The place smelled of coffee and fish chowder and wood smoke, and a woman behind the counter, broad-shouldered 60-something, with grey hair pinned up and a tea towel over one shoulder, looked up and said, "Sit anywhere, love, kitchen's slow." Greer took a table by the window. She ordered a coffee and a bowl of the chowder she didn't want. She watched the wharf through the glass while the woman moved around behind the counter, and an old man 2 stools down read a paper folded into quarters, and a wood stove in the corner ticked and shifted. For a few minutes she felt almost peaceful, in the way that strangers' kitchens can make you feel, where no one knows the shape of the hole you carry. When she stood to find the washroom, the woman pointed her down a narrow hall, past a wall of photographs, fishing boats and weddings, and a much younger version of herself standing in front of this same cafe with a man's arm around her shoulders. Greer went down the hall. There were 2 doors. One stood open to a small washroom. The other, at the end, opened onto the kitchen. And it was from there that she heard water running, and a brush working against tile, the wet scrape of someone scrubbing a floor on their hands and knees. She didn't know why she looked. She would never be able to explain it. She put her hand on the door frame and she looked into the kitchen, and there, on his knees on a folded sack with a yellow bucket beside him and a stiff brush in his right hand, working at the seam where the floor met the grease trap, was Asa. He had grown a beard. His hair was longer and shot through with more grey than 19 months should have put there. He wore a flannel shirt with the cuffs turned back and a pair of work pants, gone soft and pale at the knees, and his forearms were thinner than she remembered, roped with a kind of muscle he had never had when she knew him. The muscle of a person who lifts and hauls and bends all day. There was a smear of something across one cheekbone. He had a scar near his left eyebrow that was new. His hands stopped moving. He looked up. For a long moment, neither of them moved at all. Somewhere out front, the old man laughed at something the woman said. The fridge compressor hummed. The whole carefully built structure of 19 months. The firm, the press, the public composure. The rule she had made for herself about not crying in front of the partners, all of it slid sideways inside her, and she felt it go in her knees. "Asa," she said. He set the brush down on the rim of the bucket very gently. The way you set something down when you are afraid the sound it makes might bring people. He pulled the glove off his right hand, one finger at a time. He did not look away from her. "You weren't supposed to be the one who found me," he said. She had imagined his voice 1,000 times over 19 months, in hotel rooms, in the back of cars. On the nights she lay in a bed too large for one person and refused to move to the middle. She had imagined every sentence he might say to her on the day she found him, accusations and apologies and explanations, and the cold, flat nothing of a man who had simply stopped loving her. Not one of the sentences she had built had been that one. You weren't supposed to be the one who found me. As though there were a correct person to be found by, and she was not it. He got to his feet slowly, one hand braced on the counter, like a man older than 39. He didn't come toward her. The kitchen was small and full of the smell of bleach and the cold sea air leaking under the back door, and they stood at opposite ends of it, and she understood, looking at his face, that he was not surprised. Frightened, yes, but not surprised. He had known somewhere that this day would come. He had simply hoped it would come differently, or to someone else, or not to him. "Cole," the woman called from the front, not unkindly. "You drowned back there." "Coming," he called, and his voice was steady, and Greer learned in that one word two things at once. That he had a name here that was not his own, and that the people here did not know him, and that he had built, in a town at the end of the world, an entire life she had never been allowed to see. "Cole," she repeated very quietly. "Don't," he said. "Please, not out front. Give me an hour, I'll explain what I can." He looked at her with something that was almost begging. "There's a great deal I can't explain yet. I will. I swear to you I will. But not all of it tonight, and not here." She should have screamed. She should have walked out front and announced to the whole cafe who he was. She had earned that, surely. Instead, she heard herself say, "All right." She did not know then why she said it. She knew only that the man in front of her, in his soft worn knees and his stranger's beard, was guarding something, and that the way he guarded it was not the way a man guards a betrayal. It was the way a man guards a wound. She went back to her table. She paid for the chowder she had not touched. She told the woman, whose name turned out to be Eleanor Tobin, and who insisted on being called Mrs. Tobin by anyone under 50, that she was passing through and thinking of staying a night or two. And Mrs. Tobin said there was a room above the store with Mrs. Petrie if she wanted it, clean and cheap and cold as charity, and Greer said that would do. She did not say that she had $300 million in commissions on her books that year. She did not say that there was a car waiting for her in Toronto and a corner office with her name etched in glass. She sat in a fisherman's cafe in a town with no traffic light and waited for her husband to finish scrubbing a floor. He came to the store at 7 after his shift. Petrie's was one room above the general store, with a single bed under a quilt that someone had stitched by hand, a chair by a window that looked out onto the dark wharf, a kettle and a shelf with a few paperbacks gone soft with damp. There was no television. There was a tin of tea and 2 mismatched mugs. Greer had been sitting in the chair for 2 hours, not moving, watching the one street light at the end of the road. When she heard his boots on the outside stair, she let him in. He stood in the doorway with his toque in his hands and the cold coming off his jacket, and for a second they were just 2 people in a small lit room with the dark pressing on the glass. And she remembered, with a force that nearly took her legs out, what it had been to love him before any of this. "You cut your hair," she said, which was absurd because she was the one whose hair was different, shorter now, more practical, the hair of a woman who had stopped having time. He almost smiled. He didn't. "Ask me whatever you want," he said, sitting on the very edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees. "There's one thing I can't tell you tonight. One. I'll tell you. I need a few more weeks and then I'll tell you everything, and then you can decide whatever you decide. But the one thing, tonight, I can't. Why did you leave? That's the thing I can't tell you tonight." She laughed, and the laugh came out wrong, cracked down the middle. "Of course it is." So she asked him everything else, and he answered all of it, and what he told her rearranged the room. He had left Toronto the morning after the ribbon cutting for the harbourfront tower, the night the magazine cover came out, the night she had stood on a stage in a black dress and been called the most important architect of her generation. He had gone first to Montreal, where he'd washed dishes in a brasserie for 4 months under a name he bought from a man in a parking lot. Then west, on a bus, to a tree-planting camp outside Prince George, where he'd lived in a tent and put 40,000 seedlings into clear-cut ground and grown the arms he now had. Then back east, slowly, the way a coin rolls when you spin it badly, until he'd run out of country and money in the same week, and walked into Tobin's looking for work, and Mrs. Tobin had given him a meal and a floor to scrub, and never once asked him a question he couldn't answer. "I have not touched the accounts," he said. "Not yours, not ours. There's a checking account here under the name I use. There's $840 in it. That's everything I have in the world." He looked at his hands. "I have not been with anyone. I haven't called anyone. I haven't read a thing about you except by accident. In a newspaper somebody left on a bus, a photograph of you cutting a ribbon, and I sat in the back of that bus and I put the paper down and I made myself stop. I told myself you'd stopped looking. I needed you to have stopped looking. I stopped believing I'd find you, she said. That's not the same thing as stopping. He flinched at that, and she was savagely glad and then ashamed of being glad. Is it another person? She made herself ask. The thing you can't tell me. He was quiet for a moment. It's a person, he said. And it isn't. It's a thing one person did, a long time before I ever met you, and a thing he tried to do again the night your tower opened and I left so that he could never finish doing it. I've spent 19 months making sure he can't. I'm almost done. A few weeks. Then it's gone, and I can tell you. And you'll understand why I couldn't let it have your name attached to it. He looked up at her and his eyes were wet, and he did not let them spill. Greer, the cleanest thing I could give you was to not be in the photograph. Do you understand? The cleanest thing I had left to give you was my absence. She did not understand. Not then. But she heard the truth in it, the awful structural truth, the way you can hear that a beam is sound even in the dark. Stay here a few weeks, she heard herself say. Finish it. I'll stay too. You can't. You have a firm. You have. I have a managing partner who has been telling me to take a leave for 2 years, she said. I have a phone I am going to turn off. I have a town nobody knows me in, and a woman downstairs who thinks I'm passing through. And I am going to keep being someone passing through. I am going to take my coffee at Mrs. Tobin's, and I am going to be a quiet woman with a sketchbook, because that is a thing people will believe of a woman alone on the Cabot Trail in October. And in a few weeks, when you've finished, you are going to tell me. And then we will decide together what's left. You'd do that, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man checking the ground before he put his weight on it. I'd do that. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, the way he used to when he was young and tired, and trying not to let her see. He did not weep. He breathed. Don't tell anyone who you are, he said finally. Don't tell Mrs. Tobin. Don't tip more than a couple of dollars, people notice. Don't sit at the counter's for the regulars. Don't ask Mrs. Tobin about me, she won't tell you a thing, and she'll like you less for asking. A pause. And don't, he said. Tell me things that are too kind. I have to be able to finish this. I can't finish it if you're kind to me. Ussa Cole. Here I'm Cole. Cole, she said, and the name tasted like a stranger, and she let it. All right. She stayed. She bought, the next morning in a town 2 coves over, a pair of rubber boots and a heavy sweater, and a real sketchbook and a wool hat. And she became, in Carrick Cove, a woman called by her middle name, a quiet woman who drew the boats and the church and the long grey line where the sky met the water, and who took a corner table at Tobin's and tipped $2 and did not sit at the counter. She drank coffee she would once have sent back. She learned the town the way you learn a song you're going to need. She learned that the old man with the paper was Mr. Doucette, and that he had fished the strait for 50 years, and had a son in Fort McMurray he was too proud to phone. She learned that the woman who came in Tuesdays with her hair set was Mrs. Cabot, who had been the school teacher when there'd been a school, and who did the crossword in pen. She learned that the boy who came round with the late papers and got a donut from Mrs. Tobin for free that they both pretended he paid for was named Cormac, that he was 11, that his father was gone offshore on the rigs and his mother worked 2 jobs in Sydney, and that Cormac was saving for a bicycle so he could do a paper route in the next town as well. She learned that Werner Aucoin ran the general store and the post office and knew everyone's business and told none of it. And she learned that the man called Cole was beloved here, quietly, the way the truly steady people are loved, without anyone making a fuss about it. She had not known that about him. She had married a man who designed nothing and built nothing, who had been content to be the husband of the famous architect, who carried her coat at the openings and stood at the edges of the photographs, and she had loved him, and also, she could admit now in the cold above the store, slightly pitied him. The way you pity a calm river you assume has no current. And here was the current. Here was Cole, who fixed Mr. Doucette's stubborn outboard on a Sunday for nothing, who walked Mrs. Cabot home when the wharf iced over, who had taught Cormac how to splice a line and how to take a compliment, who knew where Mrs. Tobin kept the spare aprons and how she liked the chowder thickened, and which booth the priest preferred. The man she'd half pitied had walked into the hardest, plainest life imaginable and made himself necessary in it. On the 5th day, Cormac came in soaked and shaking because his bike, the borrowed one, had thrown its chain in the rain on the wharf road and dumped him, and Cole came out from the kitchen wiping his hands and crouched on the wet floor and pulled the boy's bike up onto its side and worked the chain back onto the sprocket with his thumbs, talking the whole time, low and easy, about nothing, about the rigs, about whether the Mooseheads would make anything of themselves this year, until the boy stopped shaking. Greer watched from her corner with her cold coffee and her sketchbook, and she drew none of it because her hand wasn't steady, and she understood that she had spent 6 years married to a man and had been shown, in 5 days, a side of him he had only let out where she could not see. That night on the outside stair, he stopped before he went down. "What are you drawing all day?" he said. "The church, mostly. The light's good in the afternoons. You hate drawing churches. You always said churches were architecture apologizing for itself." "I'm a different woman than I was," she said, "than 19 months ago," and he looked at her for a long moment in the cold, and then he went down the stairs. On the 8th day the journalist came. His name was Royce Hale, and Greer knew the name before she knew the man, because Royce Hale had been writing about her for years, the small poisoned columns, the ones that had suggested, when Asa first vanished, that her husband had run off with money, and then, when that didn't catch, that he'd run off with some, and then, more recently, in paragraphs that had grown careful and pointed, that the great Greer Maddox's sudden habit of clearing her calendar looked like a woman who knew where her runaway husband was. He came into Tobin's at 9 in the morning in a coat too good for the town and sat at the counter which marked him, and ordered a coffee, and took a long professional look around the room. Greer had her face in her sketchbook. She did not move. Mrs. Tobin set the coffee in front of him without a word and refilled Miss Doucette's cup and folded her arms. "You're not from here," she said. "Just passing through. Most folks passing through don't take a picture of my wall before they take a sip of their coffee." Hale smiled, thin and easy, and set his phone face up on the counter. "I'm a writer," he said. "I'm doing a small piece on the fish plants closing down the shore. Human interest. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." "Sugar," said Mrs. Tobin. "I haven't had a free minute since the plant was open." He laughed his thin laugh. He turned a little on his stool and let his eyes go to the kitchen door, behind which a man was running water and stacking plates, and then to Greer in the corner, who did not look up, and then back to Mrs. Tobin. "There's a fellow works here," he said. "Goes by Cole, I'm told. I'd like a word with him if he's about." Mrs. Tobin did not blink. "Cole's off today," she said. "That's funny." Hale swiped at his phone and turned it round on the counter. "I've a photo of him here from yesterday coming out the back of this very café with a milk crate." On the screen, taken from a vehicle across the road, unmistakable, was Asa in his flannel and his toque. Greer, in her corner, very carefully kept drawing. "That's not Cole," said Mrs. Tobin without a flicker. "That's McKinnon's cousin from up the Marguerite. Comes down some weeks to give us a hand. Long way to come for dish pay, I grant you, but some men like the drive." Hale held her eyes. Then he smiled and put the phone away and drank his coffee and left $2 on the counter and walked out. They watched through the window as he stood on the wharf road looking up and down it, and then got into a grey rental and drove off. Mrs. Tobin did not move for a full minute. Then she crossed the room and stood over Greer's table with both hands flat on it, and she looked down at the sketchbook, at the careful half-finished drawing of the church, and then she looked at Greer's face for a long, long moment. And Greer understood, with a lurch, that the woman had known for days exactly who she was, had probably known the first afternoon, and had simply chosen, in the way of the place, to say nothing. "I bought you an hour," Mrs. Tobin said quietly. "Maybe 2. He'll be back and he'll bring a camera next time. You and your fellow have got the length of one pot of coffee to decide what you're going to do." Cole had come out of the kitchen and was standing very still by the pass with a plate in his hand. "He doesn't have a thing," Greer said low. "A photo of a man with a milk crate. He can't prove who you are without you in the same frame as me. I could leave. I could be in Badek by lunch. He'd write whatever he wanted, and he'd have no picture, and the town's already lied for you. You'd have your weeks." She had said it to give him the out. She had said it the way you offer to fall on a grenade, and she watched his face while she said it, and she saw what it cost him to even consider taking it, and then she saw him not take it. "No," he said. He set the plate down. He crossed the café, and he sat down across from her at the little table by the window, in full view of the glass, of the road, of any grey rental that might come back with a camera. And he put his hand over hers on the cold table, and he said, loud enough for Mr. Doucette and Mrs. Cabot and Werner Aucoin, who had drifted in for her mail, to hear, "If he's coming back with a camera, then he can take a picture of a man having a coffee with his wife in a town nobody's heard of, like 2 people working a private thing out in private. He can write whatever he likes. Nobody here'll give him a word, and in a few weeks I'll be done, and I'll tell you everything, and we'll say whatever there is to say to the rest of them together. Or I won't, and you'll know why. And he still won't have his story." The whole café had gone quiet. Mrs. Tobin rang the little brass bell on the counter once gently, the way she did to call an order up, except there was no order, and Greer understood it for what it was, a signal, a closing of ranks, and she felt her throat go tight. Hale came back at 11. he was not alone. There was a young woman with him with a long lens. He opened the screen door and took 2 steps in and looked toward the window table, and there he saw a man in a flannel shirt sitting across from a woman with a sketchbook. Their hands joined on the table, and he saw Mrs. Tobin behind the counter with her arms folded, and Mr. Doucette with his paper, and Mrs. Cabot with her crossword, and Werner with her hand on the mail slot, and Cormac, who had come in for his donut, frozen by the door with his eyes very wide. Hale did not lift his phone. He looked at Greer for a long second across the room, and Greer looked back at him, and did not smile, and did not glare, and looked at him the way you look at a man who has finally walked into a room he's spent 2 years trying to get into, only to find everyone in it already knows him. He nodded once, slowly. He said something to the young woman. They both walked out, and the bell over the door rang as it closed, and Mrs. Tobin rang her own small bell again, and the cafe let out its breath. The story ran 2 days later, and it was nothing. A paragraph. A source close to the family confirmed that Miss Maddox was taking private time in the Maritimes. No photograph, no name of a town. By the next morning, the news had moved on to a banking scandal in Calgary, and Carrick Cove was by name still nobody's business. On the 12th day, there was a fire. It was an ordinary thing, the kind of thing that happens in a working kitchen once in a few years. Mrs. Tobin lifted a basket out of the fryer, and the oil caught, soft and yellow, and took the dish towel on the rail, and Mrs. Tobin reached for the extinguisher bracketed to the wall, and the bracket, screwed in badly years before by a man long dead, came off in her hand, and the canister hit the floor and rolled, and the alarm began to scream, and Greer was in her corner. She stood up and did not know what to do. But Cole, who had been wiping down the front counter, was already moving. He did not run. He walked into the kitchen, picked the extinguisher off the floor, pulled the pin, and put the fire out in 3 short bursts, low and controlled, aimed at the base of the flame and the rail, the way a man who has been taught does it. He reset the alarm. The screaming stopped. He turned to the dozen people in the cafe, and he raised his voice only a little, and he said, "We're grand, folks. It's out. Kitchen's closed half an hour to air it. Anything on your tables on the house. Anything you're still waiting on. Come back at 1. Out the front, please, not the back." And Greer watched him walk Mrs. Cabot to the door with a hand under her elbow, and hand Mr. Doucette his cap off the rack, and crouch down to tell Cormac it was all over and to take 2 donuts, not 1, and she watched him go back and sit Mrs. Tobin down on a stool because the woman's hands were shaking on the broken bracket, and say, "Gentle. Sit. I'll call the supply place about a new can. I'll re-anchor the bracket myself tonight. It wants the proper plugs. The rail needs sanding. I'll do it after close. Insurance forms in the binder under the till. I'll start the first page." "You all right?" "You're a wonder, Cole," Mrs. Tobin said, and there were tears standing in the old woman's eyes. "I'm a man with a list of phone numbers," he said. Greer was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She did not remember crossing the room. He looked up and saw her there, and something passed over his face. "Where did you learn to do that?" she said. He looked at his hands. "Mrs. Tobin made me practice once a month. Said you couldn't work in her kitchen without knowing how to put out the worst thing the kitchen could do to you. You didn't know how to do that before?" "No," he said. "I didn't know how to do much of anything before, Greer. I knew how to stand at the edge of your photographs and hold your coat. That was nearly everything I knew how to do. I've learned the rest out here." And he looked up at her, and there was no apology in it and no shame, only that strange new gravity, the steadiness of a man who has carried something heavy a long way alone and set it down for a moment and will pick it back up again. "Let me finish what I'm carrying," he said quietly. "Then ask me anything." The weeks passed slowly and quickly, the way they do when there's nothing to do but wait and live. She stayed at Mrs. Patry's. She drew the church and the boats. She learned to bank the wood stove and to like the chowder. Some evenings Cole walked her back from the cafe, the 4 cold blocks to the store, neither of them talking, her hand sometimes through the crook of his arm and sometimes not. He fixed the extinguisher bracket. He taught Cormac to splice a second kind of knot. He learned slowly to let her be in the same room as the life he'd built, without flinching. And then, on a Thursday near the end, after the supper rush, he told her. He told her on the wharf, in the dark, with the cold coming off the strait, and the one streetlight flickering at the foot of the road. Because he could not, he said, tell her indoors. He told her about a winter 20 years before her, before any of it, when he had been 22 and his mother had been dying in a hospital in Hamilton with no insurance and a stack of bills that he could not begin to pay, and a man named Hollis Crane, who lent money to desperate people and called it business, had lent him what he needed, and then had named the price. The price was a signature. Asa had signed his name to companies he never saw, moved money he never touched, been the clean young face on documents that were not clean, for 11 months, until the debt was paid and his mother was buried and he could walk away. He had walked away. He had spent the next 2 decades becoming a man who deserved to. He had met her. He had let her light fall on him and had never told her about the dark he'd come out of, because the dark was over, he'd thought, and what was the use? And then her tower had opened, and her face had been on the cover of the magazine. And Hollis Crane, old now and cornered and badly in need of a clean name to sign one last set of papers before the structures he'd built came apart, and took him with them, had seen the photograph too. And Crane had come to Asa the night of the ribbon cutting and said, "Sign again, or I'll show the world what the famous architect's husband used to do for me, and I'll do it the week before her firm's biggest commission is confirmed. And there is no board in this country that will let her build a federal museum once her husband's name is in those files." "I couldn't sign," Asa said. Signing again would only have given him another hold, and the next time the price would have been higher, and the time after that. "And I couldn't tell you, because the day you knew, you were a part of it, and then he had a hold on you, and your name was in the thing whether you signed or not." He stared out at the black water. There was only one way to take it away from him. The companies he needed my signature for had to die. They die on their own if no one signs to keep them alive. But it takes time. It takes the calendar running out on each one in turn, and it only works if I'm not anywhere he can reach me to make me sign, and not anywhere a reporter can put me beside you. So I disappeared. I've watched them dissolve, one by one, for 19 months. The last one dies in 11 days. When it's gone, he has nothing. No papers, no name to use, no story worth printing, because the only crime left is 20 years cold and mine alone, and it touches you not at all. He finally looked at her. "That's the thing I couldn't tell you. That the boy who built your absence was a boy who'd done something he was so ashamed of that he thought the kindest gift he had was to take himself out of your photograph before he ruined it." She was quiet a long time. The wind came off the water and went through her good city coat as though it weren't there. "You stupid, stupid man," she said at last, and her voice broke on it, and she put her cold hand against the cold side of his face. "You think I built a single thing in this country I wouldn't have torn down with my own 2 hands before I'd let it cost me you?" He closed his eyes. He did not answer, because he couldn't. There were 11 days left, and on the 3rd of them a man telephoned Greer's general counsel, Pearl Aldous, claiming to be a journalist with questions about 3 small-numbered companies. And Pearl, who had been quietly retrieving 20-year-old records for weeks, and who recognized a fishing expedition when she heard one, told him the firm did not comment on entities outside its public registry, and hung up, and called Greer that night on the gas station payphone 2 towns over. Crane was panicking, she said. He could feel the last one slipping. He was trying to push the story sideways, to heat the press up around Greer's name in the city, so that anyone seen with her became news, so that if Asa surfaced now, in these last days, it would be a headline and not a paragraph, and the noise might just spook a board. So Greer did the thing she would not have believed herself capable of 19 months before. She left. She drove back the long road to Sydney at dawn and flew to Toronto, and walked into her own firm at 10 in the morning. And her managing partner, who had been holding the place together for 19 months, embraced her in the lobby in front of 3 startled juniors. She gave a careful interview to a friendly reporter and said she'd been traveling, that she'd needed the time, that her husband was a private matter she would not discuss. She let herself be photographed at a gala. She let herself be photographed at a sight walk in a hard hat with the mayor. She let herself be photographed alone, leaving the magazine cover behind her in the lobby of her own building, the most boringly visible architect in the country, for 11 days, while in a town at the end of the world the last of Hollis Crane's companies ran quietly out of calendar and died. The man who had called Pearl did not call again. No story ran. On the morning the last entity dissolved, Pearl filed the 20-year-old proof of what Crane had done away in a vault and did, on Greer's instruction, nothing with it but hold it, because there were 2 prosecutors in 2 provinces who were already, on their own slow schedules, beginning to ask why a numbered company in Hollis Crane's web had been signed for all those years ago by a man whose name turned out, on examination, to be a boy who had since become no one at all. Greer drove back the day after, the same long road, the same bend toward the water. She walked into Tobin's, and the bell rang over the door, and the smell of coffee and chowder and wood smoke folded around her like a coat, and Mrs. Tobin looked up and smiled and said, "Sit anywhere, love." Mr. Doucette raised his cup. Cormac, who was folding napkins in the corner because his bike was in the shop and his mother had asked Mrs. Tobin to keep him out of trouble after school, ran over and hugged her round the middle and ran back. And Cole came out of the kitchen in the flannel shirt with a smear of flour on his cheek and stopped when he saw her. And the whole cafe pretended very hard not to watch. She crossed to the window table and sat down. He came and sat across from her and put his hand over hers. "It's done," he said. "It's done. Will you come home?" she said. He looked at her, and then around the small bright room at Mrs. Tobin and Mr. Doucet and Cormac and the wall of crooked photographs, and then back at her, and she watched him understand that home was not a single place anymore and never would be again. "Yes," he said, "but not all the way gone from here. I'm not going to be a man who let these people hide him for a year and a half, and then drove off the minute he didn't need hiding. We come back, as often as we can manage. I want to be here for Mrs. Tobin's birthday, and for the fall supper, and for the Christmas concert where Cormac is going to be a wise man, and forget half his lines and deny it to his grave. I want a small house eventually, not a city thing. Something with a porch and a wood stove and a spare room for Mrs. Tobin when her knees finally quit, and a yard where that boy can keep his bike out of the rain. Could you build us something small, do you think? You've only ever built things that were big." She put her other hand on top of his, so that his hand was between both of hers on the cold formica, the way you warm something you have nearly lost. "I've been wanting to build something small," she said, "for 19 months. Outside, the light was going off the water the way it does out east in the late afternoon, gold and brief, and the one street light at the foot of the wharf road flickered on, the way it had flickered every night she had been there, and the cafe was warm, and the kettle was on, and somewhere behind them, Mrs. Tobin rang the little brass bell on the counter, once gently for no order at all.